Hi, this is Alex, and if you love music, well, you've come to the right place because we're all about albums. Today we're going to talk about what I think is the greatest album of the entire 1960s. Just like I did in the 1950s, this is sort of a monumental task, but hopefully you'll at least see my point of view of what I think is the greatest album. However, more importantly, I also want to discuss what I think is the album that represents the decade of the 60s. Also a tough task, but I think once I give you my reasons, hopefully you'll be able to understand, and maybe some of you out there will agree with me. If you don't, I'd love to hear from you in the comment sections below. The 1960s was a time for social change, and music came along for the ride. Also, music was able to influence some of the social changes. The 1960s started much like the ending of the 1950s with rock and roll music and popular music. Also, surf music became to be important in the early 60s in the States. Popular acts of the 1950s, including Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, and Chuck Berry, did not have quite as significant a voice in the 1960s. What happened in the early 1960s was new popular type bands were starting. There was also an increase in the folk music scene. The folk singers were influenced and focusing on the social issues of the day, which was racial inequality, women's rights, as well as the anti-war movement of the Vietnam War. Along with the rise of popular music was the rise of R&B, as can be seen in the Motown sound. In 1959, Berry Gordy Jr. founded Motown, and this popular music was the first time that there was some racial integration in the popular music scene. There were many crossover artists from the R&B charts into the popular music charts, and this was very significant in the early to mid 1960s. On November 22, 1963, the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated in Texas. After the assassination of the president, the country went into mourning. The U.S. was ripe for something to bring them out of their melancholy, and sure enough, another monumental event occurred in early 1964. Many of you may recall this event. I certainly do, even though I was quite young at the time. On February 9th, it was a Sunday, 9 p.m., the Ed Sullivan Show introduced the Beatles. At the time, 73 million people tuned in to watch the Beatles perform on the Ed Sullivan Show, and at that time, that was a record. This not only ushered in the Beatles into America, but also this opened up the doors to what became known as the British invasion. As the decade went on, other music genres started developing. First was the fusion of folk music and rock, which was folk rock and was epitomized by the Byrds. The Byrds did influence the Beatles by this sound. Additionally, there was a harder edge to rock music that was starting, as well as the psychedelic sound of the mid and late 1960s. So our task is, how do we pick an album that represents this entire decade? We move from a time of innocence to a time of enlightenment with the folk singers, and then moved into a more mature sound in rock music, and finally into psychedelia. So I think the first step is to find out which band should represent the entire 1960s. I think this part is somewhat easier. The band that most people associate with the 1960s is the Beatles. And I agree. I think the Beatles are the band we should look at to see which of their albums would represent the entire decade of the 1960s. That task is a bit more difficult. We want to find a Beatles album that shows a sound change, a transformation from a time of love songs and innocence into a more mature sound with social consciousness, as well as a look to the future of the remainder of the decade, what we can expect. I think when we look at the Beatles catalog, the pivotal album of the Beatles that showed a more mature sound, a more sophisticated sound, was Rubber Soul. I feel that Rubber Soul is the album by the Beatles that best represents the entire decade. Rubber Soul was released in the United States on December 6, 1965. It went to number one quite quickly and was in the US number one on January 1st of 1966. It remained number one album for 11 weeks and remained on the popular charts for 49 weeks. This album sold 1.2 million copies in the United States in just 9 days, which broke the record at the time for most albums sold in such a short period of time. Rubber Soul can be seen to be influenced by the songwriting skills of Bob Dylan, as well as the folk rock sound of the Byrds. This Beatle album was rather unique in that it had more acoustic music, it had more storytelling, an introspective look, and also introduced the sitar to the popular music scene. This album showed growth for the Beatles and a more mature type sound. This is probably the first Beatle album where the lyrics were as strong as the music. In an interview from Q magazine in November of 2007, Brian Wilson said of Rubber Soul that it is first his favorite Beatle album. Brian Wilson was quoted in saying that Rubber Soul was the greatest folk album he's ever heard. He concludes by saying that Rubber Soul inspired his masterwork Pet Sounds, and Pet Sounds went on to inspire Sgt. Pepper's. At this stage in the Beatles' career, they had much more say in the final product. They had much more say in the studio and how to produce the album. The Beatles were able to devote more time and money into their efforts. Rubber Soul is an album that moved away from creating hit songs and rather creating just a great album. Paul McCartney was quoted in saying about Rubber Soul, "We are so well established that we can bring our fans along to stretch the limits of pop." This was a bold step that the Beatles were taking. They were leaving their formula for hit records behind. There are other changes that this album brought about. First, we look at the album cover. The album cover itself, if you look at it, is the first album that did not say the word The Beatles anywhere on the front album cover. Also, the photo for the album cover taken by Robert Friedman was a step away from the Beatles. This was showing a more serious and mature look to the Beatles. Many of you know this iconic album cover with the elongated faces of the Beatles. This came about by accident. Robert Friedman was showing them the pictures he took, and he was projecting it on a cardboard, and the cardboard slipped back slightly, and this elongated the faces of the Beatles. They instantly loved this effect and asked Robert Friedman if this could be the album cover, and he said, sure, why not? The lettering that was used for the title Rubber Soul became the standard for psychedelia lettering. Also, this showed the mood that the Beatles were in, and some even say that this showed the drug use of the Beatles at that time. In 2003, Rolling Stone magazine came out with a special edition entitled The 500 Greatest Albums of All Time. Rubber Soul was on the list, and it was very high in position. It actually, by Rolling Stone, was the number 5 album on their 500 list. The issue of the 500 Greatest Albums was updated, and in the most recent update of September 2020, Rubber Soul did not stay at number 5. It dropped down, but still kept a position of number 35. This likely relates to the many new contemporary artists that were included in the most recent update of the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Albums of All Time. So now we come to the point of the video where I'm going to reveal my choice for the greatest album of the 1960s. A lot of great albums came out in the 1960s. Great soul, great jazz, great pop music. You can make an argument for a half a dozen different albums being chosen as the greatest album of the 1960s. However, I again stayed with the greatest band of the 1960s, the Beatles, and I chose their last studio album, Abbey Road, as the greatest album of the 1960s. This album was released in the United States on October 1st, 1969. It did reach the number 1 on the charts and stayed there for 11 weeks. It sold 5 million copies in the first year, and this is quite astonishing in that Sgt. Pepper only sold 3 million copies in its first year out. Now again, a typical trivia question about the Beatles. The Beatles' last recorded album is Abbey Road. Their last released album, however, is Let It Be. What's very interesting about the Abbey Road album is that this album almost never got made. Due to personal issues in the band was on the verge of a breakup. But in January of 1969, Paul McCartney reached out to the other Beatles, as well as asking George Martin to come back and be the producer of the album like he has done prior. And he also invited Geoff Emerick, the sound engineer, to be the primary engineer on this album. Geoff Emerick left after the White Album due to the tension felt in the studio during the recording of that album. When discussing the type of album the Beatles wanted, George Martin and Paul wanted a more symphonic sound, something that was more unified into a concept type album. However, John, on the other hand, wanted a rock and roll sound and was rather after single songs that typified this. As a compromise, side one of Abbey Road was a bit more of a rock and roll sound, as well as many songs that were unrelated. Side two was more of a cohesive symphonic sound, as Paul and George Martin would say. The album was started to be recording in February of 1969 and concluded in August of 1969. However, the bulk of the album was recorded in the months of July and August of 1969. Another interesting fact about Abbey Road, it was recorded on an 8-track machine rather than the typical 4-track that they had used, for example, on Sgt. Pepper. Abbey Road is one of the most iconic album covers. Almost everyone in music knows this album cover. Again, this is an album cover that did not have the name The Beatles on it, but it was certainly quickly recognized as a Beatles record. The album cover was taken by Ian McMillan. It was shot on August 8th of 1969 at 11:30 a.m. It was the fifth picture taken from the photographs Mr. McMillan took. An officer came in and stopped traffic so that they can take a shot of the classic album cover. What's interesting is we can see the four Beatles walking away from EMI Studios on the cover. I guess portending things to come. Additionally, the famous back cover of Abbey Road shows a woman in a blue dress walking by, and it is fuzzed out. And Ian McMillan, for him, this was a mistake, and he didn't want to even show this photo to the Beatles. But of course, this is the picture that the Beatles loved best. And so that's what we find on the back cover. There are several firsts or trivia that can be talked about on Abbey Road. As we said, Abbey Road is the last recorded album, but not the last released album. Additionally, the Moog synthesizer, which was a new instrument, was used to give an electronic type sound to the album. Also, this is the first Beatle album not released in mono. You can only get this album in a stereo recording. Additionally, engineer Geoff Emerick's assistant was Alan Parsons. Many of you know who Alan Parsons is. He actually was the engineer who recorded Dark Side of the Moon. Another interesting fact is that the album Abbey Road is the only time in any of the Beatle albums that Ringo had a drum solo. And that is on the last song of the album called, of course, The End. And that's when you will hear Ringo on his own giving a great drum solo. Another interesting fact is that George Harrison's song Something was for the first time an A-side to a single released on a Beatle album. This has not happened before. Now what's interesting is the B-side to this single is Come Together. So it's interesting how the times have changed. Many Beatle fans have always said that George never got his fair shake. And that can be said even at the time of the release of this album. Years later, John Lennon was interviewed, and he was noted to say that he never gave George enough credit. He thinks that his two best songs on the entire album. That's a high compliment. And finally, there's also some controversy. Chuck Berry's producer brought a lawsuit against the Beatles for their song Come Together. The lyrics to open the song are quite similar to a Chuck Berry song. This Chuck Berry song is called You Can't Catch Me. As most of you know, Yesterday is the most recorded composition by the Beatles. However, most of you might not know the second most recorded composition by the Beatles is Something by George Harrison. So where does Abbey Road rank on the Rolling Stone top 500 albums of all time? Well, when the first issue came out in 2003, it was ranked number 14. Yes, Rubber Soul was number 5 and Abbey Road was number 14. Who would have thought? However, in the 2020 update, the times have changed and Abbey Road was now the number 5 greatest album of all time. And as I said, Rubber Soul dropped to number 35. George Martin was quoted by saying of Abbey Road that it was a very happy record, and that it was a happy record because everyone thought this would be the final Beatles record. Of all the albums you can hear in the 1960s, the most perfect side to an album is side 2 of Abbey Road. Most people love the medley from start to finish. Gorgeous, great musicianship, great 3-part harmonies. So the Beatles came back together for one more hurrah and came out with their greatest album that they've ever done. And to my mind, the greatest album to come out of the 1960s. Okay, well, let's talk about last video's unknown album. The first unknown album, well, you saw a picture of Paul McCartney smoking a cigarette, and that is the back cover of Rubber Soul. So I know a lot of you know that picture. Many of you may have said, what album did that come from? But it was Rubber Soul, which was the album we talked about quite a bit on this video. So I won't give any further discussion about the album. The second unknown album is one that is familiar to a lot of people. Others are kind of scratching their head going, well, it looks like a psychedelic album. Which one is it? Well, it's a famous album by the Zombies, which was released in 1968, and it is Odyssey and Oracle. The reception of this album was lukewarm, and there was no fanfare about this Zombies album. However, over time, this album achieved fame and was started to be seen as one of the great accomplishments of the 1960s. In the 2003 edition of the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, this album reached number 100. On the 2020 update of the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, the album had dropped to number 243. Interestingly, most of the album was recorded in Abbey Road Studios and was actually recorded on the same 4-track Studer tape that was used for the recording of Sgt. Pepper's. During the recording of this album, there was tempers flaring within the band. The main singer, Colin Blunstone, did not want to sing in the style that was asked to be sung by his bandmate Rod Argent on their what to become later a hit song, Time of the Season. There were 2 singles released from this album, Care of Cell 44 and Friends of Mine, both of which did poorly. Additionally, there was not very many requests for the Zombies to perform at that time period, and because of this, as well as the arguments within the band broke up even prior to the release of the album. Odyssey and Oracle was released in Great Britain on April of 1968. The album was not released until June 1968 in the States, and it was released on a small label of CBS Records called Date Records. The song Time of the Season was starting to get traction towards the end of 1968 and early into 1969, and in March of 1969 climbed quite high in the charts. At this point, the band had already disbanded, and therefore there was no tour for this album at all. A tour did occur, but occurred for the 30th anniversary of the album. The album cover was designed by Terry Quirk. Terry Quirk was actually the friend of one of the band members. Terry Quirk made a mistake. If you see Odyssey, the first word of the album cover, instead of the first Y for Odyssey, O-D-Y, it was spelled O-D-E. It was a mistake, but the band tried to say, no, it was on purpose, which it really wasn't. Many of you out there don't realize that you actually heard one of the songs on this album used in the credits of a few famous TV series that have been on. This song is called This Will Be Our Year, and it was seen in the ending credits from season 2 of The Marvelous Miss Maisel. Additionally, this song was used in the closing credits for the series finale of Schitt's Creek. And now for this video's unknown album, the first unknown album. Okay, hope you got that one. The second unknown album. Okay, great. If you know the answers, let me know in the comment section below and I'll let you know how you did. As always, this is Alex with All About Albums. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. And remember, keep them spinning.